Hello, I'm Toby Haydoke, and you can't rewrite history. Not one line. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what, and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about finding the good in peoples and places, no matter how different they may seem. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your Aztec high priests from your Tauran woodbeasts, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, it's an episode which helped cement Doctor Who's anarchic approach to time travel by establishing a cardinal rule about changing the past so inviolable that it could only be gleefully ignored whenever it made for a better story. So join me, Toby Haydoke, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Temple of Evil, or It's Raining Men. First broadcast, 23rd of May, 1964, at 5:16 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman. It was written by John Lucarotti, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Crockett. It was watched by 7.4 million people, and the audience appreciation was 62. Barbara and Susan emerge from the TARDIS into the tomb of a 15th century Aztec priest. They find a concealed exit, so Susan goes back to fetch the Doctor and Ian. When they leave the tomb, however, Barbara has vanished. And to make matters worse, the door closes behind them, separating them from the TARDIS. They meet Ortlock, High Priest of Knowledge, who believes Barbara to be the reincarnation of the High Priest Yetaxa. In turn, he takes the Doctor, Ian and Susan to be Yetaxa's servants. But Totoxal, High Priest of Sacrifice, doubts Barbara's divinity, so he stokes a rivalry between Ian and the great warrior Ixta. Meanwhile, the Doctor is horrified to learn that Barbara plans to change history by bringing an end to the Aztec practice of human sacrifice. The When. 31st of January, 1964. At Lime Grove Studios, John Lucarotti attends the recording of The Roof of the World, the first episode of his Doctor Who adventure Marco Polo. He is approached by story editor David Whittaker, who asks him if he has further ideas for Doctor Who, and Lucarotti suggests a story set at the height of the Aztec civilization. For a time, Lucarotti had lived in Mexico, which remains dotted with relics of its indigenous cultures to this day. The Aztec metropolis of Tenochtitlan, for example, is now the heart of modern Mexico City. Lucarotti became fascinated by the Aztecs, and he was particularly drawn to the sharp contrasts which their society exhibited. The Aztecs were keen astronomers, but they forged no metal implements. Their medicine was sophisticated, but they had no appreciation of the potential of the wheel. Their agricultural practices were advanced, but, most infamously, human sacrifice was a regular component of their religious worship. This dichotomy ultimately contributed to their decimation in 1521 by armies under the command of the Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés. Lucarotti suggests that this setting would be ideal for a character-driven drama. 4th of February, 1964. John Lucarotti's Aztec story is added to the Doctor Who production calendar as Serial F. As such, it will come immediately after Terry Nation's hastily written science fiction adventure The Keys of Marinus, which now follows Marco Polo in the schedule. 10th of February 1964. In the wake of a recent agreement that the 4 regular cast members will each be granted a fortnight's holiday over the course of the Doctor Who production block, Carol Ann Ford's agent and husband, Walter Jokel, submits a list of potential dates for his client's vacation. Ford would like to be absent for 2 weeks at some point between 15th of April and 31st of May, although Jokel notes that June would also be acceptable. David Whittaker responds a week later, on the 17th of February, to indicate that he will work to comply with this request. 24th of February 1964. David Whittaker again writes to Walter Jokel, this time with more specific information about when Carol Ann Ford can be released from Doctor Who. Plans for John Lucarotti's story, which Whittaker inaccurately describes as involving the Mayan tribe of South America, are now coming together, and Whittaker believes that Ford can be absent from studio recording for the 2 middle episodes scheduled for the 8th and 15th of May. This will make Ford the second of the principal actors to be granted their holiday from Doctor Who, following William Hartnell's omission from the 3rd and 4th instalments of The Keys of Marinus. Unlike Hartnell, however, Whittaker hopes that he can make arrangements for Ford to maintain a presence in the 2 episodes to be taped during her sabbatical. Jokel replies the following day to indicate that the proposed dates are acceptable to his client. 25th of February 1964. David Whittaker formally commissions John Lucarotti to write the 4-part The Aztecs. Carol Ann Ford's absence will be covered by limiting her involvement in episodes 2 and 3 to material which can be pre-filmed before her vacation. Although we'll revisit this topic in more detail in the next Too Much Information, the Temple of Evil nonetheless performs some of the heavy lifting by setting up the scenario which facilitates Ford's sojourn, Susan's confinement to a seminary as punishment for interfering with a human sacrifice. 16th of March 1964. This is John Lucarotti's delivery date for The Aztecs, which has been written on his houseboat moored off Mallorca, Spain. Lucarotti has been travelling to London as necessary to meet with David Whittaker. However, he has been navigating some personal issues and is now beset by illness, delaying the completion of his work. 17th of March 1964. John Lucarotti delivers 2/3 of The Aztecs, and he works through the remainder of the day in the production office. It's unclear if this represents 2/3 of the entire serial or 2/3 of a particular script, in which case it's presumably the concluding instalment, The Day of Darkness. 18th of March 1964. John Lucarotti submits the remainder of The Aztecs. David Whittaker decides that it looks good, needs some work, and immediately sends copies of the scripts to James Bould, the BBC's design manager. 24th of March 1964. By now, The Aztecs has gained its director, in the form of John Crockett, who was also responsible for The Wall of Lies, the 4th episode of Marco Polo. Crockett has previously worked on educational programmes, through which he has apparently acquired some knowledge of Mesoamerican history and culture, and so he has been deemed a good fit for The Aztecs. On this day, Crockett receives a memo from Donald Wilson, the head of serials, forwarding concerns expressed by the planning department regarding the late delivery of design information for the Aztec temple set, which will be required for pre-filming at the Ealing Film Studios. The necessary information is finally conveyed to designer Barry Newbury the following day, although its lateness is partly mitigated by the subsequent decision to delay the pre-filming by 5 days, from the 9th of April to the 14th. 8th of April 1964. In preparation for the forthcoming filming, stunt performer Tom Booth attends a costume fitting for his stunt sequence. On the same day, he is issued with the terms under which he is earning his fee of £29.08, although his fitting today will earn him another £10, in writing, having previously engaged in a verbal agreement with Crockett to appear in the episode. The paperwork states that, in consideration of this fee to be paid to you in respect of the services you are to render, you hereby agree and confirm that the British Broadcasting Corporation will not be liable to you or your estate or your dependents for any loss, injury or death suffered as a result of your rendering such services, the risks of which are hereby voluntarily accepted by you with full appreciation thereof and in full knowledge of the abnormal, hazardous and dangerous nature of such services. 14th of April 1964. At Ealing, Booth performs those services, the shot of the sacrificial victim jumping to his death in The Temple of Evil. The jump he performs is approximately 5 feet. 27th of April 1964. Rehearsals for the Temple of Evil get underway at the Territorial Army Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road. After consulting with Barry Newbury, John Crockett has asked for the Aztecs to be made in a large studio, perhaps at BBC Television Centre. Newbury has suggested that the extra space will be important to help sell the illusion of the painted cyclorama, which will provide the view of the Aztec city from atop the temple. However, Crockett's request is refused. Attending rehearsals is actor David Anderson as the Aztec captain. Production assistant Douglas Camfield managed to get Anderson involved in Marco Polo after Anderson got him out of trouble during an altercation in a pub. Camfield seems to have recommended Anderson, who is involved with a judo club in Shepherd's Bush, to whomever he can, much to the consternation of stuntman Derek Ware, a RADA-trained equity member who resents the presence of non-trained, non-union men on set. Anderson will get a biography in a future Too Much Information, but it is worth stressing here that he is not the Scottish actor Dave Anderson, whom IMDb, Wikipedia, and indeed a recent issue of Doctor Who magazine insist he is. A tiny bit of cross-referencing the two men would show how impossible this is, yet despite Too Much Information's best efforts to correct the internet sources, they keep getting changed back. So let us state for the record that what you may have read elsewhere about Anderson is incorrect. 1st of May 1964. The Temple of Evil is recorded not at Television Centre, but in the narrow confines of Doctor Who's usual production home, Lime Grove Studio D. Donald Wilson, who was instrumental in the show's development, is watching from the gallery. Cameras roll from 8:30pm to 9:45pm, preceded by a photo call during the afternoon, which includes shots of Jacqueline Hill in Aztec regalia. One of the extras featured in this episode is Lionel Gadsden, playing one of the old Aztec men in the garden. Despite going uncredited, he is worth a mention because as far as current research stands, he is Doctor Who's earliest born performer, coming into this world on the 14th of August 1879, the year Thomas Edison filed a patent for his first incandescent light bulb. He was only 46 when television was created and lived half his life in the pre-TV era. And it's a life that is in its twilight years, as Gadsden is to die less than 18 months later, on the 9th of November, 1965. The recording day today overruns, which results in an overtime payment for Tom Booth that gets him another £2 and 2 shillings, taking his total fee up to £41 and 10 shillings, the equivalent of about £1,100 in 2025. Certainly more than you'd get paid for a couple of lines in a TV episode today, although, of course, he also performs a stunt. The incidental music for episode 1 is also recorded today, with 9 musicians, each getting £5 for their contribution. This pattern will be repeated weekly for all episodes of The Aztecs. At some point after recording, Sidney Newman casts an eye over the Temple of Evil and scribbles some notes. His verdict? Intro to New Land Week. Jackie fluffing. Needed better close-up of bracelet, and more of it. Where's Barbara? Only a fool would say this. Butcher, phony speech, Shakespeare, he fluffs. Bad profiles of old priest. Rotten pastoral music, pre-execution. She sounded insincere, not queenly. Well, we're all entitled to our opinions, the head of department especially so, but it's nice to see executives stating the bleeding obvious, pointing out fluffs when the recording necessities prevent going back and doing the whole thing all over again for a relatively minor infraction. I mean, does Newman really think they didn't notice them? Is not a 21st century malaise only. 4th of May, 1964. Carol Ann Ford jets off on a comet on holiday to Lisbon today, departing from London Airport but pausing for a snap with her daughter Miranda for some press photographers. She tells the papers she's looking forward to no more frights for a fortnight, trading them in for just lounging in the sun. 9th of May, 1964. The North Western Mail runs a profile of John Lucarotti as an early preview to this new adventure. As well as the Aztecs, he is writing a play for the BBC's First Night Strand, which also has a Mexican setting. I lived in Mexico for 6 months and loved the country and the people. I shall try honestly to present the character of the Mexicans. He's done a lot of research on the Aztecs and has been helped by an expert on the subject. Aztec culture was literally wiped off the face of the earth. They were a highly civilized and cultured race. Children were strictly disciplined, there was a high standard of morality, people retired at 50, their knowledge of astronomy was equal to ours today, yet they cut out human hearts for sacrifices. There's a record of them having cut out 10,000 hearts in one day. The article assures the viewer, however, that, I gather we shall not see this gaudy piece of history in Doctor Who's time with the Aztecs. Even so, Lucarotti is not especially interested in writing for children, he says. However, the big challenge for me is getting kids interested and at the same time slipping into the action some knowledge they may not have had before. Writing for children is also very good discipline. You can fool adults with things you never get away with children. He also tells the newspaper something which provides some insight into why the Aztecs is the kind of story it is. My interest stems from the idea that history is not places and dates and events, but people. People trying to cope with their daily lives, their personal problems and careers. I always try to relate history to the personalities involved. 21st of May, 1964. One of the photos taken of Hill depicting the Doctor and Barbara accompanies a preview of the Temple of Evil in the Radio Times. Here, Jacqueline Hill says of Doctor Who,
I don't regard it as fantasy. The notion of how the travellers reach their destinations may be fantastic, but when they get there, they're involved in reality.
While noting that Hill and her husband, producer Alvin Rakoff, have no children who might be in a position to critique her performance in Doctor Who, the article quotes Hill as saying,
But our best friends have 2 children, and one of them is usually ready to tell me when I have gone wrong.
22nd of May, 1964. The Exeter Express and Echo previews the Aztecs by asking, I wonder how many adults take a peep on Saturday afternoons at Doctor Who. I suspect the answer would be staggering. It's hard to resist a bit of science fiction occasionally, and Doctor Who, unlike my pet hate, Fireball XL5, seems to have acquired a degree of authenticity. The columnist then gives Mums and Dads a sneak preview of the forthcoming episode, informing readers of the advice and research that went into Lucarotti's scripts in order to provide them with the aforementioned authenticity. 23rd of May, 1964. The Temple of Evil is broadcast, with the transmission slipping 1 minute past the scheduled 5:15 p.m. start time. 500,000 viewers who skipped the concluding episode of The Keys of Marinus return for the start of this new story, nudging Doctor Who back up to the 7.4 million viewer mark. That's good for 25th place in the weekly chart, 18 places higher than last week. On the other hand, the audience appreciation figure has dropped, albeit by a trifling 1%, to 62. A number of papers have publicised the serial, many of them using a photo of Ringham, Hartnell and Russell. The column in the Sheffield Star states that, a few months ago, after I praised the BBC serial Doctor Who, a reader politely informed me that I must be in my nonage. I have long mislaid his letter, but I recall he wrote something like this. It's sheer hokum, no wonder the BBC are losing viewers. They're completely out of touch with the public. Reminder to Too Much Information listeners that this is 1964, not 2025. Columnist Will Carter continues, informing his correspondent that Marco Polo received 10 million viewers, and he rebuffs the suggestion of hokum. Hokum? Surely it's only the method of time travelling which qualifies for this description. The adventures which befall the occupants of the good ship TARDIS, at each point of call in time or space, never stretch fantasy too far. They had the great merit of being well constructed, well written, and adequately acted, and there have been some highly original touches in the cliffhanging. He points to the historical accuracy of Marco Polo impressing viewers and reveals that Lucarotti had had previous success with the subject matter on Canadian TV and brought the wealth of detail he had accrued to bring to bear on his Doctor Who serial. Our doughty columnist then previews the Temple of Evil and concludes that, again, the painstaking Lucarotti has researched deeply into the period and taken expert advice on the detail of the scripts. I think this is worthy of a late-night repeat during the week. How about inserting it into the Thursday Wilderness, BBC? The Nottingham Evening Post is one paper which highlights Lucarotti, pointing out that it's a lucrative evening for the writer because he's also written The Pirates, the episode of The Protectors premiering in some ITV regions tonight. Not the Robert Vaughan series, this, by the way. That hasn't been invented yet. This is about a security agency and stars Andrew Folds. Other newspapers run a variation of this story, and many preview the new adventure, most of them giving a rundown of the story and giving the basic details about Lucarotti. English by birth, Canadian by citizenship, son of an army man, born in Aldershot, grandson of an Italian sculptor, served in the Navy, was a door-to-door salesman, wrote a big Marco Polo serial for Canadian TV. Marco Polo's 10 million viewers also come up a lot. Pictures of Hartnell, the funny double-chin one, and Hill in Yetaxa garb are chosen to illustrate some of them. The Bournemouth Evening Echo's brief piece mentions that the columnist and many children of his acquaintance prefer the future adventures to the past ones. 28th of May, 1964. Bill Edmond reviews The Temple of Evil for the stage and television today. After patronisingly, albeit era-appropriately, opining that Jacqueline Hill should be given a chance to look beautiful instead of worried, Edmund speaks highly of the guest cast. Ian Cullen's Ixter, he says, is a cocky character straight out of a boy's paper, while as Tretoxel, John Ringham is a man who glared, mouthed, and hated from the moment he appeared. Says Edmund of Tretoxel, if we are to have a villain, let him be a villain from the word go. Edmund also recognises the efforts of Barry Newbury, who has taken extreme care to fill every nook and cranny with what looks like genuine Aztec ornaments and oddments. The What? The opening credits lead us not to new footage to kick off the Aztecs, but to a telecine recording of the closing moments of the previous serial, The Keys of Marinus, as the TARDIS dematerialises from that eponymous world. The action here isn't continuous. Any number of adventures could take place during the fade to black that follows. Although he has already established himself as Doctor Who's resident expert on historical design, Barry Newbury finds the Aztecs to be more challenging than his previous assignments. 13th century China in Marco Polo and the Stone Age environment of An Unearthly Child. This is because of the relative scarcity of information about the Aztec Empire during the time period in which John Lucarotti's story is set. Indeed, this difficulty seems to have been anticipated by the Doctor Who production team who, unusually, engage an outside expert to help with the Aztecs. This specialist is Joan Rodker, who is perhaps best known for her anti-war activism in association with organisations like the World Peace Council. During the 1950s, Rodker had spent a year in Mexico and, like Lucarotti, was inspired by her surroundings. The result was a documentary called Mexico of the Plumed Serpent, which was broadcast as part of the ITN Roving Report on the 2nd of November 1960. Rodker soon found herself working as a researcher and a script editor, including on Armchair Theatre, where she met production assistant Verity Lambert. Within a couple of years, of course, Lambert would become the producer of Doctor Who, so it is presumably this connection which has led to Rodker providing some measure of assistance on the Aztecs. In the event, Barry Newbury has drawn upon various artefacts of Aztec culture to inspire the scenic design, perhaps none more striking than the mask adorning the skeleton of Yetaxa, which greets us at the start of the opening scene. It's effectively identical to one of the so-called turquoise mosaics held by the British Museum, and has its origins in the appropriate period, dating from between 1400 and 1521. It was taken from Mexico in the mid-19th century by Bram Hertz, a German-born diamond merchant, art collector and antiquarian living in London. The British Museum describes it as a human skull covered with turquoise and lignite mosaic held in place with pine resin adhesive. The nasal cavity is lined with red thorny oyster shell. The eyes are made of polished pyrite surrounded with white conch shell. There's no real turquoise, lignite, oyster shell or conch shell in use here, of course, but the skull and the rest of the skeleton are genuine. In the real world, the mask is thought to represent Tezcatlipoca, a god whose wide-ranging portfolio includes darkness and conflict. Lucarotti largely avoids naming any of the Aztec deities, with one exception, as we'll see, but the script describes the mask as representing the sun god. Aztec mythology is not short on solar deities, but Lucarotti's Target novelization, published in 1984, suggests that he specifically meant Quetzalcoatl, who will later be described by Tretoxel as him who has fallen. When they emerge from the TARDIS, stage directions tell us that Barbara is intensely interested, while Susan is a little scared by the atmosphere of the place. Susan's explanation that
the Aztecs were Mexicans
is a late addition to the camera script, providing a little more geographical orientation for younger viewers who might be unfamiliar with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Another last-minute amendment was Barbara's speculation that the High Priest had died around 1430. Originally, she responded to Susan's question about what year it was by simply stating,
about 1430.
Which probably seemed like a bit of a leap given that the tomb could have lain undisturbed for decades or even centuries. John Lucarotti prompts Barbara to laugh in response to Susan's comment about really knowing your subject, but Jacqueline Hill adopts a less frivolous approach to the scene. Barbara then tells Susan that the Aztecs were
one of my specialities.
In the camera script, however, they were more pointedly my speciality. Presumably, it was felt that Barbara would benefit from a somewhat broader range of expertise, especially if the TARDIS was going to continue hopping back into Earth history every couple of trips. Nonetheless, we've already got an inkling of Barbara's interest in the Aztecs. In The Sea of Death, the first episode of The Keys of Marinus, she compares the construction of the pyramid housing the conscience of Marinus to the techniques used by
the Indians of Central and Southern America,
of whom the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans are probably the best known. Susan only earns 9 marks out of 10 for her assertion that Hernan Cortes landed in 1520. He actually made landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula on the 21st of April 1519, having set out from Cuba on the 10th of February. In the camera script, Barbara concurs with the date of 1520, but on screen she's less committal, perhaps distracted by her surroundings, or perhaps deciding to lead that level of pedantry to the podcast writers of 60 years hence. When Barbara and Susan open the door, stage direction suggests that daylight floods the tomb, having previously noted that the only light in the tomb comes from the TARDIS. On screen, however, there's only a slight change in the light levels, most noticeable on the wall behind Susan. When Ortlock is introducing himself to the Doctor, Susan and Ian, the Doctor is meant to reiterate that their new acquaintance is the High Priest of Knowledge. However, William Hartnell slightly flubs his line, referring to Ortlock simply as the High Priest. In the camera script, Tretoxel is an unkempt, revolting figure of a man. His hair is matted, his loose-fitting garment stained with blood. His on-screen appearance isn't quite that horrifying, giving the impression that Ian's description of Tretoxel as the local butcher has more to do with his demeanour, infamously adapted by John Ringham from Laurence Olivier's hunchbacked performance as the eponymous Richard III, than with the state of his clothes. Ringham, incidentally, had worked with John Crockett before on a variety of stage productions dating back to their time with the Compass Players in 1948. Most recently, they'd collaborated on All for Truth, an adaptation of Molière's The Misanthrope, and Dostoevsky's The Idiot, both staged by the Icon Theatre Company at the Lyric Theatre Hammersmith in 1962. When Tlatoxel is describing to Ortlock his plan to present Barbara to the Aztec people, John Ringham deviates from the camera script in a couple of notable respects. First, he repeats the phrase, "A vision is with us," from his preceding line. He was meant to simply say, "A vision will stand before them, and I, in supplication to the rain god, shall offer human blood." The slightly awkward, "No more talk against us that the gods were against us," is also a slip. The camera script instead has, "No more talk against us that the gods were angry." After Tretoxel questions Ortlock's fidelity to him who has made us strong, the cut to a close-up of Ortlock hides the first of 2 recording breaks in The Temple of Evil. It allows Jacqueline Hill to change into her Yetaxa garb, as well as for a redress of the temple set. Here, "him who has made us strong" is a euphemism for Huitzilopochtli, the southern hummingbird who was a war god and a sun god, and who was believed to require regular nourishment in the form of human sacrifice. By the way, an alternative translation of Huitzilopochtli is left-handed hummingbird, which fans of prose Doctor Who will recognise as the title of a 1993 entry in Virgin Publishing's Doctor Who The New Adventures range, a Seventh Doctor novel written by Kate Orman. Meanwhile, "him who has fallen" is an oblique reference to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who was, amongst other responsibilities, a god of learning. Historians disagree as to whether the Aztecs considered him a supporter of their sacrificial practices or an opponent. Another notable change in Tlatoxel's dialogue here is his final line, after he has urged Ortlock to honour the god who has made them strong. In the camera script, he then avers, "He demands blood and he shall have it." On screen, Ringham inserts, "He has made us rulers of this land," with the last two sentences therefore serving as a corollary to this statement. Now we get to see what has become of the temple set. It has been transformed from the simple place it was into something much more lavish, according to the camera script, most obviously by the addition of a throne. When Susan asks Barbara in reference to Ortlock if he thinks she's a god, she simply responds,
"Yes,
In the camera script, Barbara instead offers the more diffident,
I suppose so."
Ian is scripted to mispronounce Ortlock as Ortok, but it sounds like William Russell instead goes with Orklock. To our ears, it's not such a gross error, so the way Ian's fellow travellers pounce on his gaffe seems a little excessive. But perhaps the Doctor is just glad to finally hear someone else get a name wrong for once. Ian's subsequent exchange with Barbara is expanded on recording, to clearly establish Yetaxa as the name of the divinity for whom Barbara has been mistaken. In the camera script, this is just implied by Ian asking if he, Susan and the Doctor are now believed to be Yetaxa's servants. Hartnell seems misled by the addition, which results in him repeating his charming quip. After Ian suggests that they should find out how the tomb door opens, the camera script has Barbara promise,
"I'll ask."
On screen, however, we skip directly to the Doctor's caution against doing so. At the end of this speech, the Doctor provides a stark warning that the consequence of the Aztecs seeing through Barbara's deception is that "we shall all die." The camera script isn't quite as pointed. Instead, the Doctor more obliquely suggests that "we won't last long." Following the arrival of Ortlock and Tlatoxel, an Aztec deity is actually referred to by name. This is Tlaloc, described here as the rain god. More generally, he oversaw the sustenance of Aztec life, so his roles included fertility. In his production subtitles for the Aztecs DVD, Matthew Kilburn persuasively argues that John Lucarotti retained Tlaloc's name because it's the only one amongst the major Aztec pantheon that isn't a terrific tongue twister. Certainly the serial's credibility would have suffered if the characters had stumbled over a Quetzalcoatl, and the logistics of television production in 1964 would have discouraged a costly edit to deal with a mispronounced Huitzilopochtli. When Ortlock asks Yetaxa to allow her servants to circulate amongst the Aztecs, a stage direction notes that Barbara is not too sure. William Hartnell struggles with the speech that follows. He's meant to say, "Thus may we be your eyes and ears among the people, and learn how best to serve all our interests." Instead, he winds up with the garbled, "That way we may be your eyes and ears among the people, to do our best and serve in all our interests." Well, it may be a word soup, but it still manages to get the Doctor's point across, more or less. He's also meant to indicate that only he and Ian should be granted this boon, but on screen, the decision to exclude Susan seems to be Barbara's alone. After the High Priest's departure, William Hartnell approaches Jacqueline Hill too closely, leaving him hidden behind her floral headdress. Camera 4 is forced to crab to the left to compensate. When the Doctor contends that "we now have everything we want, exactly," Barbara's surprised
"We do?"
is unscripted. Another unscripted line arises in the next scene when Tlatoxel informs the Doctor and Ian that Ian will be trained to command the Aztec army. Absent from the camera script is the Doctor's response, "Surely that is for Yetaxa to decide." Tlatoxel's subsequent reference to the Garden of Peace is a change from the scripted The Temple Garden. This deprives Kameka of being the first person to reveal its more idyllic name. In the next scene, we meet Ian Cullen as Ixter, a well-built young man, a few years younger than Ian, writes John Lucarotti. We actually see less of Ixter than the script requests, since it indicates that he should be naked from the waist up. On the other hand, surviving production documentation suggests that we very nearly didn't see any of Ian Cullen at all. Instead, it seems that Michael Graham was originally cast as Ixter. He had recently appeared in 3 episodes of Z-Cars, as well as programmes such as Moonstrike and Dr. Finlay's Casebook, alongside an uncredited role in the movie Carry On Cabby. Graham is listed as playing Ixter on a summary of wardrobe, hair and makeup requirements dated the 7th of April. His name is also included on an undated list of actors' fees for the Aztecs, but there it has been crossed out and replaced with Cullen's. Ixter's shadow combat was more involved in the camera script. It sees him reject one club, he doesn't like the balance, for another, this one he likes, and later practising with a shield before Tlatoxel calls to him. Ixter's sparring partner, credited on-screen as Aztec Captain and in the Radio Times as Warrior Captain, is portrayed by David Anderson. We also saw him a few weeks back when he played a caravan warrior and a soldier in Marco Polo. It was Anderson who arranged the mock combat we see here, but if it all looks a little awkward, there's a good reason for that. In the name of historical accuracy, Barry Newbury decided that most of the Aztec weaponry should be made out of plywood, or in some cases, fiberglass imitating wood. However, Cullen and Anderson found the lightweight and fragile clubs very difficult to wield in a convincing manner, resulting in the slow-motion choreography that winds up on screen. But this could also be another symptom of Anderson's lack of experience, which resulted in the ire of established stunt people like Derek Ware. Ixter's boasting to Ian includes a notable divergence from the camera script. Here he promises that he will be the Aztec commander who defeated the chosen servant of Yetaxa, but on screen, defeated instead becomes killed. After Ixter reveals that he and Ian will be responsible for delivering the human sacrifice, a second and final recording break follows the fade to black. It provides an opportunity for Ian to change into Aztec armour and for the anteroom set to be redressed. Now we move to the Garden of Peace, where we meet Kameka, who was originally going to be called Amekameka. According to the script, she is peering at the Doctor with more than average interest, but is doing it apart from the others. There are a couple of notable dialogue variations between the camera script and the performances of William Hartnell and Margot van der Burg. First, the Doctor's question about the temple designer Chapal. Did he set out this garden as well? Becomes a less specific, "Oh, he designed all this, did he?" Then, whereas Kameka was scripted to say of Chapal,
"He watches over it constantly."
Van der Burg modifies this to,
"He watches over us constantly."
Which makes rather less sense of the Doctor's subsequent inference that Chapal is the gardener. Ian arrives dressed in the livery of an Eagle Warrior. The Eagle Warriors were one of 2 elite cadres of Aztec soldiers, both notable for admitting not only nobles to their ranks, but also highly achieving soldiers of common blood. Their counterparts were the Jaguar Warriors, and we will shortly see that Ixter is one of them. Both Ian and Ixter wind up in helmets that largely cover their faces. As we'll discover in The Day of Darkness, this is an intentional design decision which will help mask the use of stunt doubles when Ian and Ixter finally have their inevitable altercation. Ian's statement that the Rain God ceremony takes place today is a late addition to the camera script, presumably to heighten the tension and urgency of the subsequent scenes. In the camera script, after the Doctor implores Ian not to interfere, he warns that, otherwise, the time travellers will all be dead within a minute. It sounds like William Hartnell starts to deliver this line, but William Russell jumps in early with "but" that prompts the Doctor's next line. When we move back to the antechamber, it has been redressed for Barbara and Susan's leisure time. The flower that Barbara holds replaces a scripted banana she is supposed to be munching on, which is meant to be indicative of her behaving in a most ungoddess-like manner. The script also suggests that Susan should strike a Vogue pose whilst wearing the jewelled headdress, in reference to the venerable fashion magazine. The direction posed no problem for Carol Ann Ford, who had prior modelling experience. After the Doctor tells Barbara of the plan for a human sacrifice at the imminent ceremony, a late addition to the camera script is his reference to Ian agreeing with him. The Doctor has clearly sussed out whose opinion Barbara values the most, and it isn't his. The oft-quoted climax of the Doctor and Barbara's confrontation includes several departures from the camera script. First, Barbara's statement that
"It's no good, Doctor. My mind's made up."
replaces an assertion that
"The priests won't dare defy me."
Then, it's Barbara who's meant to introduce the episode's most famous metaphor. When the Doctor asks, "What are you talking about?" her response was originally to begin,
"Rewriting history."
The Doctor was then to warn her, "You can't change history, not one line of it." On screen, of course, these two elements are combined to create the Doctor's memorably incendiary admonition, "But you can't rewrite history, not one line." As the sacrifice begins, a line not found in the camera script is Susan's tremulous,
"Why can't I see what's going on?"
This helps make it clear that the Doctor and Susan are out of the way of the main action, at least until she runs out to interfere, setting up Carol Ann Ford's fortnight away from Doctor Who. After Barbara reveals herself to the crowd, represented solely by sound effects, the script has Ortlock join her as she returns to the sacrificial victim. In the televised version, however, she remains by the edge of the pyramid. When Tlatoxel begins his exhortation to the gods, Camera 2 has an unfortunate collision with the sacrificial stone as it tries to push in on John Ringham. The picture tilts, then rights itself very noticeably. The death of the sacrificial victim isn't the only film element required for the episode's climax, as it happens. The ensuing footage of a stormy, lightning-tossed sky is taken from BBC stock and is awful quality, certainly in the broadcast version. Tlatoxel's vow to destroy Barbara, speaking directly to Camera 3, ends the episode on a memorable note. Another lift from Olivier's Richard III, it also represents the first instance of Doctor Who breaking the proverbial fourth wall by addressing the viewing audience. But it's not quite the note upon which the camera script intends the Temple of Evil to conclude. After the title of the next episode, The Warriors of Death, appears, there's meant to be a fade from Tlatoxel to telecine footage of rain falling on stones, over which the closing credits are intended to roll. Instead, we get the usual fade to black, with John Ringham gamely continuing to act until he's no longer in vision. The Who. Sir Richard Rodney Bennett. The Who. Richard Rodney Bennett. Richard Rodney Bennett, who composed the incidental music for the Aztecs, may have only scored one Doctor Who story, but he's one of the programme's most illustrious and decorated contributors. His journey to the very top of his profession, and indeed to the gates of Buckingham Palace, stay tuned, began on the 29th of March 1936 in Broadstairs, Kent, where he was born, the first son but third child of children's writer but former singing teacher and operatic singer Harry Rodney Bennett, and the pianist and composer Joan Bennett, whose claims to fame included being a vocalist during the very first live performance of Gustav Holst's Planet Suite. Harry had discarded his first name when at University College Reading, feeling that Rodney Bennett more suited a burgeoning bass baritone. The family were actually based in London when Richard was born, but with the onset of war they relocated to Devon. His parents were distant, and the children weren't allowed to play with toys, so Richard used the provided pens and paper to write and name pretend music. He couldn't read the notes he was copying from various sheets littered around the house. These were purely, at this point, visual creations. He could hear music, though. His mother used to play, and the house was filled with Debussy and Ravel. Despite this and their shared love of music, Joan's insistence that emotions were not to be expressed meant that young Richard was never entirely granted the vocal approval from her that he so desperately sought. Perhaps as a result of this, the chance to express himself and unleash his emotions into the playing of music was relished by young Richard, and he had learned to read music by 4 and had thrown himself into playing the piano wholeheartedly before his 5th birthday. He did injure himself, though. He fell on some broken glass, severing a nerve in his right wrist, which prevented him from ever being able to stretch his fingers completely thereafter. However, he managed to teach himself to play, reading the sheet music to hand and creating his own harmonies in order to modernise them. He went to St Ronan's School, temporarily located at Bicton House, just outside Budleigh Salterton, in 1943, as a weekly boarder. His music aptitude was noted, but so was his disobedience, but he was considered a good pupil, despite considering his time there as the very worst time of my life. He was bullied and felt as though he'd been sent away as a punishment by his remote father. Struck down with bronchitis as the war ended in 1945, Richard was relocated to a happier environment, nursed back to health by a Miss Bratt in her large, elegant country house. He was now a voracious radio listener, having been barred from listening to it at Bicton, and had discovered a love for the Great American Songbook and Noel Coward. But he was soon packed off to school again, this time at Bereshanger School, 20 miles from Broadstairs, but 200 miles from Casa Bennett. The headmaster, Charles Stocks, was liberal-minded and forward-thinking, and so Richard's creativity was allowed to flourish unfettered. On one long journey back from school, he bought a music magazine and was exposed to the work of Elizabeth Lutyens, which was a turning point. His sympathy for modernism started here, and he even plucked up the courage to phone Lutyens, who was delighted someone so young had taken an interest in her. At school, he wrote piano music, carols for the school choir, and songs for his sister Meg to sing. He also made his acting debut, playing Ophelia in the school's production of Hamlet. One Easter holiday in 1948, Rodney died after an illness that the family never discussed. But although 12-year-old Richard was upset, mostly for his mother, he confessed to never really knowing his father. Having been spotted at Bereshanger, young Richard was virtually headhunted by the Quaker public school Leighton Park. He fell in love with it at first sight, so his planned move to rugby school was altered after he achieved a scholarship. The Quaker environment was one in which Richard flourished, and he wrote a sonata for viola and piano in his first year there, and a string quartet in his second, and he played piano in a dance band, writing many of the tunes they played at end-of-term dances and the like. He also entered talent competitions in the holidays, using the cash from his winnings to buy music and records. His fan letters to Elizabeth Lutyens had resulted in an invite to visit her, and he frequently descended upon her, taking in her opinions of his compositions, and she was a huge influence on him. He travelled to Germany and Denmark with the Reading Youth Orchestra, and confessed his attraction to another boy to his headmaster, a liberal man who did not punish him for this, though Richard's sexuality was the subject of tacit disapproval from his own mother. He also wrote cheeky satire for the school magazine. He was in his final year of sixth form when 2 compositions of his were given professional performances in London, which won glowing notices in the national press. He then won a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music, which he attended from 1953. He was greatly influenced by one of his tutors there, Harold Ferguson, who regarded him very highly indeed, and his first published pieces, his sonata for piano, came while he was still a student there in 1954. The Royal Academy didn't do as much for him as he had hoped, though. "I learned much more in Westminster Music Library," he said. His professional name was always a triple moniker, to avoid confusion with Richard Bennett, another musician. In 1956, he scored his first screen work. Having been introduced to the highly respected John Hollingsworth, musical director of Denham and Elstree and Hammer Films, Richard, at 19, scored The World Assured for the British Insurance Association, writing his music cues without having seen a second of the film, working blind and to timings. but Richard was impressed with the quality of musicians who performed his work for this relatively humble project, and was even more impressed when he was paid £100 for his troubles. Having performed with his collaborator Cornelius Cardew the British premiere of a two-piano piece from Pierre Boulez in his final year at the Academy, Richard subsequently, from 1957 to 1959, was a scholarship student of Boulez, one of the giants of post-war contemporary classical music in Paris, getting up close and personal with the master's techniques in serialism. Boulez asked him to play his demanding compositions, but Bennett kept his hand in with screen work, which prevented him from imprisoning himself within the world of complex serialism. His first proper film, Interpol, came along in 1957. More films followed, which prompted newspaper interest in this young, brilliant musician who, at 21, was composing for Hollywood movies. And he wasn't averse to TV appearances either, popping up on 6-5 Special for an interview, rubbing shoulders with hip young things like Pete Murray and Adam Faith. It was a happy time, not least because he had come to terms with his own sexuality, learning not just the French language in the nightlife of Paris, gay Paris indeed. By 23, he was living with his partner, Richard Norojny, in a smart Marylebone flat, and was a comfortably off young man whose star was in the ascendant. That year, 1959, he got his first commission for the Royal Festival Hall, which also generated much media attention, and the film work continued to pour in, and he ended up as the go-to composer for a number of noted directors, including Joseph Losey, John Schlesinger, and Sidney Lumet. His notable scores from this period include Losey's Blind Date, 1959, Hammer's The Man Who Could Cheat Death, 1959, and Guy Hamilton's The Devil's Disciple, 1959. His first opera, The Ledge for Sadler's Wells, came in 1961, and soon he was able to buy a house in Islington outright, but Norojny did not move with him, though they remained friends. Instead, Richard Rodney Bennett was about to enter perhaps the busiest period of his working life, which took in first-class travel to America to do a last-minute rescue of the film Satan Never Sleeps, 1962, scoring the classic Billy Liar, 1963, visiting New York for the first time, which would be a life-changing moment, and scoring some programme called Doctor Who, which wouldn't end up being an important part of his career, but we're still jolly grateful that he did it. Richard had admired a tenor, Dan Klein, from afar, and to his surprise, fate ultimately brought them together, and when Dan offered to nurse him after he'd been hospitalised with hepatitis, the two were soon living together, though there could of course be no mention of such things in any of the mountains of press coverage that Richard got in the 1960s. He became one of the most distinguished movie soundtrack composers of his time, with subsequent credits including Billion Dollar Brain, 1967, Lady Caroline Lamb, 1972, and Equus, 1977. His scores for Far From the Madding Crowd, 1967, Nicholas and Alexandra, 1971, and Murder on the Orient Express, 1974, each earned him an Oscar nomination, and Murder on the Orient Express was successful in winning a BAFTA award. Later works included Enchanted April, 1992, the blisteringly successful Four Weddings and a Funeral, 1994, The Tale of Sweeney Todd, 1999, and the BBC TV version of Gormenghast, 2000. Although serialism interested him, he brought other influences to bear on his own compositions, and his eclectic abilities led to him composing studies for piano, for opera, The Mines of Sulphur, commissioned by Sadler's Wells in 1965, and, in tandem with his composing, a career as an admired jazz pianist. From 1976, he collaborated with the Mississippi singer Marion Montgomery in cabaret shows and on albums, and in 1977 he was awarded a CBE by the Queen, though he forgot the etiquette of exiting backwards after a seat of his honour, so nonplussed was he by having his name announced incorrectly. They forgot the Rodney. He moved to New York in 1979. Dan joined him on and off, but the separation ultimately ended their relationship, much to Richard's painful regret, though they remained friends until Dan's death in 2009. where Richard played the piano in the foyer of the Algonquin Hotel and toured the world singing and playing jazz, often accompanied by the likes of Cleo Lane and Annie Ross. His US green card was facilitated with the help of Leonard Bernstein, for whom he wrote a symphony for the New York Philharmonic, and Stephen Sondheim. From the 1990s, he partnered with American vocalist Mary Claire Harron and also returned to the Royal Academy, where he served as International Chair for Composition, and in 2005 he began performing with British jazz singer Claire Martin, a popular partnership excelling in classic interpretations of popular songs. Over the years, his other collaborators also included an eclectic array of people such as folk singer Jean Hart, opera's Maria Ewing, Scottish percussionist Evelyn Glennie, the mighty Eartha Kitt, and the legendary Paul McCartney, best known, of course, for appearing in Doctor Who's The Chase, a year after Richard's contribution to the show. In 1995, the Gay Times nominated Richard as one of the most influential people in music. In 1998, he was honoured again, and this is when he became what he remains at the time of this recording: the earliest person credited in Doctor Who to become a Knight of the Realm. Interestingly, Paul McCartney is the next... Yeah, all right, he's not credited, but he's the next person involved in Doctor Who to be knighted. For "Arise, Sir Richard" was the refrain at Buckingham Palace that year, and so thereafter he was Sir Richard Rodney Bennett, although the honour, ironically, came when he was blighted with chronic conductor's block, something which was fortunately lifted the following year. In 2001, there were a series of celebratory concerts marking his 65th birthday in London, and soon he bought a flat in Wimbledon, dividing his time between there and New York. He was also the subject of a South Bank Show TV special, painted, and was gifted at making collages, some of which are now highly sought after. And he is the subject of a hugely detailed biography by Anthony Meredith, which, despite being a large and hefty volume, running to nearly 400 pages, only gives Bennett's beautiful score to the Aztecs a passing mention, when surely it's one of the most distinctive compositions in the classic Who oeuvre, despite what Sidney Newman felt. He didn't rate Jacqueline Hill either, so was he ill? The fact that Doctor Who troubles biographies of Bennett so little says everything about his subsequent career, and nothing about the Aztecs. When he died on Christmas Eve 2012, aged 76, the composer and writer Darrell Brunswick wrote that Richard Rodney Bennett could hardly have designed his career better to alienate critics in every one of the fields he was so talented in. He also described him as a cultured gay man, and every aspect of his creativity was defined by elegance. He would not go for strong avant-garde statements in any genre. It was contrary to his very core. He wanted and achieved a refined style in both his music and his life. The Telegraph noted that music by Bennett could and did turn up at any and every opportunity, and he remains undoubtedly one of the hardest composers of the 20th century to pigeonhole. Bennett was survived by his sister Meg, also known as the poet M.R. Peacock. Sir Richard Rodney Bennett leaves behind over 200 concert works and 50 film scores, a fitting legacy for one of Britain's most respected and versatile musicians. Tom Booth. Tom Booth, playing the first victim here, is one of that small number of Doctor Who contributors about whom we know practically nothing, apart from the fact he was probably a stuntman. He turns up here, jumps off a ledge, never to be seen again. And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. And what an episode it is, raising, for the first time, but hardly the last, the question of whether the TARDIS might provide a means to interfere in human history. With the exception of the delightfully oddball The Edge of Destruction, Doctor Who has, at this stage in its short history, treated the time machine as little more than a way to deposit its occupants at the appropriate starting point for the next adventure. Indeed, this is why writers have taken great pains to either disable the TARDIS or separate it from its passengers, whether by virtue of fluid links spuriously in need of mercury, Italian explorers seizing it in the name of their patron monarch, or seemingly impenetrable doors sealing it within an Aztec tomb. Having helped set the scene, the ship now has to conveniently be taken out of play until it's needed to whisk everyone away at the story's end. Essentially, the TARDIS has fulfilled the same role as, say, Rod Serling at the start of each new instalment of The Twilight Zone. Vital to get proceedings underway, but otherwise existing on no more than the periphery of the narrative. But that starts to change with the Temple of Evil, because it's here that at least one character, Barbara, of course, has come to recognise what the TARDIS might empower her to do. She's a time traveller now, so maybe she can do away with the Aztec practice of human sacrifice. Maybe she can ensure that Hernan Cortes sees not just the evils of the Aztec ways, but also their myriad accomplishments. Maybe she can prevent the cultural genocide that must lie no more than a handful of decades in the future, beyond the lifespan of the Aztec she meets, but perhaps not that of their children or their children's children. And while Barbara gives no voice to what it might mean if she succeeds, what colossal ramifications could result if more than 400 years of Mesoamerican history is fundamentally and incontrovertibly altered, for the viewer, this must awaken new dramatic possibilities inherent in the format of Doctor Who. It leads to the Doctor and his companions becoming less the observers of history that we saw in Marco Polo, and instead more active participants in it. It won't be long, for example, before we see the Doctor inadvertently inspire Nero at the start of the Great Fire of Rome in the Romans. And this notion reaches its full flower in the summer of 1965, when we meet a time traveller who's determined to accomplish exactly the kind of thing that Barbara tries and fails to do. In fact, less a time traveller, more the time meddler. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Before we leave this train of thought, though, let's spare a moment to consider the Doctor's reaction to Barbara's plan. His immediate response about rewriting history gets all the attention, of course. But what about his next line? "What you are trying to do is utterly impossible," he tells Barbara. "I know. Believe me, I know." Oh, the questions that raises. If it raises an eyebrow today, imagine the intrigue it must have incited in 1964. When audiences still knew virtually nothing about the Doctor's origins. How exactly does he know it's impossible? Did he himself once try to accomplish something similar to what Barbara intends? The emotional heft with which William Hartnell inflects his words certainly implies that this may be the case. Alas, as to the who, what, where and when, well, even too much information can only wonder. Oh, and I'm rather mad about being handmaiden to a goddess. The Temple of Evil. Featured Keith Pyatt as Ortlock, John Ringham as Trotoxel, Ian Cullen as Ixter, Margot van der Berg as Kameka, Tom Booth as the first victim, and David Anderson as Aztec Captain. The title music was by Ron Grainer and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, the incidental music by Richard Rodney Bennett, the story editor was David Whittaker, the designer Barry Newbury, and the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, for the first time, we have an episode which sequesters one of the main cast in the film studios at Ealing. Perhaps it's a good thing that the ship is locked away in Yetaxa's tomb, or Susan might have wound up advising Ian and Barbara from the confines of the TARDIS scanner. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Warriors of Death. Or, with friends like the Doctor, who needs enemies? Too Much Information, The Temple of Secrets, was presented by me, Toby Haydock, from a script I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone. With thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, and special thanks to Kral Thal. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, called Far Too Much Information, which is, for now, exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures with my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast. So if you want to hear me talking about The Invisible Enemy or School Reunion, then head to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. References. Too much information would, of course, contain far too little information if it weren't for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that have been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those intrepid high priests of knowledge who were responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The sacrifices they must have made too. The production subtitles on BBC's video DVD of the Aztecs were written by Matthew Kilburn and are a treasure trove of insight and information. Newly available from Telos Publishing is the Doctor Who Production Diary, Volume 1, The Hartnell Years by David Brunt, the deepest dive ever undertaken into the surviving documentation that depicts the making of Doctor Who. This goldmine of day-to-day details will let you feel as though you're sitting in the office in 1964, peering over the shoulders of Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. The Doctor Who Production Diary is the latest to a small library of splendid reference books that chronicle the earliest days of Doctor Who. They span Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who The Early Years, to the titanic tag team of Doctor Who The 60s and Doctor Who The Handbook, The First Doctor, by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, to the indispensable Doctor Who The Complete History Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History, which is co-edited by Mark Wright, boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson and Alistair McGowan, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for the Aztecs can be found in issue 266, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Alan Barnes studied the Aztecs in issue 516, although he gets David Anderson wrong, but we'll get to that later. Anthony Meredith's biography of Richard Rodney Bennett, published in 2010 and written with the cooperation of its subject, was of course breathtakingly helpful with this episode's The Who section, as was Adam Sweeting's Guardian obituary of its subject and the Telegraph obit too. They always go without a byline, so I'm afraid I don't know who wrote it. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of that premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 28 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time Travel. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Aztecs, although this one is more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. And finally, information about the turquoise mosaics can be found on the website of the British Museum. I walk in the shadows of giants, even if the paths they tread sometimes lead to me sitting in front of my computer at unmentionable hours of the night, staring at pictures of a decorated human skull and finding myself unable to shake the feeling that it might just be staring back. These podcasts would not be possible were it not for the contributions of the denizens of Patreonville. You can become a patron by signing up for as little as £3 a month. And people who've done that include Ruben Herfindahl, Stephen Moffat, not that one, Peter Burns, James Curray Smith, Peter Harness, yeah, that one, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Tim Arding, Nigel Bromley, Paul Cook, Richard Chalk, Peter Chamberlain, Grant Davidson, John Deere, Chris Dunford-Kelk, Paul Dunn, El Pandras, Susie Ferguson, Jason Gorman, Siobhan Galichon, Paul Harris, Chris Hyam, Ian Key, Ashley Knight, Joe Llewellyn, Ian K. McLachlan, Philip Marsh, Nathan Martin, Roland Moore, Rick Moran, Kevin Murdoch, Graham Knott, Adam Parker, Barry Platt, Risto Matti Cirillo and Frank Shales. So, if you would like to become a patron, you can do so, as I say, by going to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. You don't just get your name read out, you get bonus releases, advanced releases, exclusives. I'm even branching out into doing commentaries on non-Doctor Who stuff that will be with the participation and input of patrons only. I'm trying to make it more fun to just hang out there exclusively, but the Doctor Who stuff does all make its way out, as you can tell because you're listening to this. But I feel I do need to prioritise the patrons because they're what keeps me going, and it's a lovely community out there, and there's lots of, it's just a nice place to sort of hang out and sort of enjoy Doctor Who if you like, and even if you don't enjoy certain bits, people say so in a nice way. So patreon.com/Toby Haydock starts at £3, goes up to whatever you like, but £3 I think per month is a pretty reasonable entry level for the amount of stuff that goes on there. And there's also Ko-fi, which is a way of sending me the odd donation every now and again if you've particularly liked one or two things that I've done but don't want to be fettered by a monthly obligation. Totally get that. And if you can't or don't want to support financially, that's completely understandable. But what you can do is like and subscribe everywhere you can, 5 stars everywhere you can, and a few lines of review, which just really help to make this stuff go noticed. I particularly like some help with the YouTube stuff because I've been putting these on YouTube in order to because people have asked me to, but then they don't show up as being watched all that much because obviously they're not visual things, and most people do them the audio way, as you would expect. But it does make me look a bit like Johnny No Mates, especially as everything appears twice for some reason. I don't know why, and I don't want to delete one or the other because people sense because it gets about half the amount. Anyway, never mind. You can also join me on social media. I'm on Twitter and what else? Everything. Blue Sky. I've got a Facebook page. YouTube, do subscribe to my YouTube channel, and Instagram as well. I'm not the only one I'm not on is TikTok, and probably some I haven't heard of. So yeah, thanks. Please do that. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you're very well. It is currently one of the hottest days of the year, and I'm sitting in a cupboard, so I'm going to stop now and go and stand on a ledge and enjoy the sun. And if it disappears, sacrifice someone to it.